young ones, if you want to find Job, you can turn to the middle of your Bible and find the book of Psalms, the largest book in the Bible. And Job is the book that comes right before Psalms. If you have the Geneva Bible, you'll find it on page 512. Book of Job, chapter 1, and we'll be looking at verses 1 to 22. There was a man in the land of Uz called Job, and this man was an upright and just man, one that feared God and eschewed evil. And he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and his family was very great, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. And his sons went and banqueted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And when the days of their banqueting were gone about, Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job thought, it may be that my sons have sinned and blasphemed God in their hearts. Thus did Job every day. Now on a day when the children of God came and stood before the Lord, Satan came also among them. Then the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord, saying, From compassing the earth to and fro, and from walking in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou not considered my servant Job, how none is like him in the earth, an upright and just man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But stretch out now thine hand and touch all that he hath, to see if he will not blaspheme thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Lo, all that he hath is in thine hand. Only upon himself shalt thou not stretch out thine hand. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. And on a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, there came a messenger unto Job and said, The oxen were plowing and the asses feeding in their places. And the Sabaeans came violently and took them. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword. But I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, another came and said, The fire of God is fallen from the heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and devoured them. But I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, another came, and said, The Chaldeans set on 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have taken them, and have slain the servants with the edge of the sword. But I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, came another, and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from beyond the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, which fell upon the earth, the children, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Then Job arose and rent his garment, and shaved his head, and fell down upon the ground, and worshipped, and said, Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord hath given, and the Lord hath taken away, taken it. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this did not Job sin, nor charge God foolishly. You follow the sermon in your bulletin if you'd like. The title of our message this morning is simply The Prologue. The Prologue is the first 2 chapters of the book of Job. The Prologue. So this is part 1 of the Prologue. Our introduction. Trying to root Job in history where he might have lived, but I can assure you it's of no importance in the text. Our introduction. Job likely lived around 1520 BC, in the days of Abraham, or slightly after Abraham. This appears in the fact that Job's wealth consists in animals and servants. Also, Job offers sacrifices without the intervention of any high priest, because it's assumed he lived at a time when the law was written on the heart, not yet given to Moses. So Moses' law was not yet given. Also, the age of Job. Job lives 140 years, which was the lifespan during the patriarch period of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course, it shrunk after that. Job lived in northern Arabia, and it is debatable whether or not he was a Jew. Doesn't really matter. Many, however, argue that he was a descendant of Abraham. There are 3 points to our message this morning, verses 1 through 5. Job, upright and just on earth. Verses 6 through 12. First dialogue between God and Satan in heaven. Verses 13 through 22. 4 disasters against Job on earth. Our context. The structure of this book, at least for the first 2 chapters, is an alternation between events that occur on earth and then occur in heaven. For instance, in Job 1 through 5, we read of Job's piety. That word piety means his goodness, his righteousness, on earth. Then in Job chapter 1, 6 to 12, we read of the first dialogue between God and Satan in heaven. So first in earth, then in heaven. Then in Job 1, 13 through 22, we read of 4 disasters against Job on earth. Then next week we'll look at Job chapter 2, verses 1 through 7a, and we see a second dialogue between God and Satan in heaven. And then finally, Job chapter 2, verses 7b through 10, we read of the personal afflictions of Job on earth. So as you can see, a scene in heaven, in earth, a scene in heaven, a scene on earth, a scene in heaven, a scene on earth. And that makes up the entire prologue of the book. In this morning's text, we will examine the first 3 parts, including the first chapter of Job. Our first point, verses 1 through 5, Job, upright and just on earth. Verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz called Job, and this man was an upright and just man, one that feared God and eschewed evil. The author begins by establishing that Job is a righteous man. The theme of this book is the innocent suffering of Job. The author begins by making it clear that Job does not suffer because of some deserved sin. The opening verse makes it plain that Job could be any man or every man. He is just a simple man who lived in the land of Uz, but very righteous. It does not matter if he is a Jew or where the land of Uz was located. All that matters is that what happens to Job can happen to any of us. The author wants to make clear that Job stands for any man who is innocent yet suffers disaster. It is a narrative deliberately meant to be outside of time and outside of place, making it applicable to everybody. Job is described here first by 2 words, upright and just. Job is upright, which means blameless, and refers to his manner of living in relation to God. Just means righteous and refers to his manner of living in relation to his neighbor. These 2 words summarize the duties of the 10 Commandments, to love God and to love our neighbor. Job obeyed the law written on the heart, not yet given in the law of Moses. Furthermore, we're told that Job feared God, meaning that he had respect and reverence for God's plan, regardless of whether it was of personal benefit to him. And that he also eschewed evil, which means he walked a straight path of righteousness, keeping to the right way, the godly path of the law, not turning to the left or the right. It goes on to describe the piety of Job, verses 2 and 3. And he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, and 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and his family was very great, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. In these verses, we continue to read of the great prosperity of Job, which are a direct result of his obedience. God promises, if it fits his will, prosperity to those who keep his law. As Job was blameless towards the law, so he prospered. For instance, we read here he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Children, we know, are a gift from God, mentioned as the finest blessing a man can have, Psalm 127:3, and even as a reward, Psalm 128:3 and chapter 14, verse 2. Also in the scriptures, numbers are very important. For instance, the number 7. He had 7 children, symbolizes completion and perfection, such as in the 7 days of creation, or as you can find in Ruth 4:15, 1 Samuel 2:5, Jeremiah 15:9. So it's as if God gave him the perfect number of children, of boys, 7. Job also had 3 daughters. 3 is also a symbolic number of perfect wholeness, such as in the Trinity. So he gives him 7 sons and 3 daughters. Perfect. Even the 7-to-3 ratio carries importance throughout the Bible. We read of the perfect proportion of 7 sons and 3 daughters, of 7,000 sheep in this same text, and 3,000 cattle. And even of Solomon, who had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That ratio is of significance. Job's possessions are also the result of his uprightness and piety. Job's wealth is described entirely in terms of his cattle and servants, Genesis 12:16, 26:14, etc. Job possesses a great deal of land for the planting of food and grass for his cattle, as well as even gold, as you can read in Job 22:31 and 42. The term sheep here, used in the text to describe his wealth, refers to both sheep and goats, which customarily graze together, Matthew 25:32. Camels were used for carrying loads, Genesis 37, 2 Kings 8, as well as riding, Genesis 24 and 31. Oxen were used for pulling, 2 Samuel 6, and for carrying loads, 1 Chronicles 12:41. Female oxen, or here in the text called she-asses, are mentioned for their quality of milk production and for breeding. They were also better for riding. All oxen could be used for carrying burdens, Genesis 42:26, for plowing, Deuteronomy 22:10, threshing, and even riding, 2 Samuel 17:23. The servants here are mentioned last, not because they're less important than the cattle, but because the cattle were tended by these servants. The servants are mentioned as property because technically they are the property of Job. Job, we're told, therefore, in these 3 verses, was the greatest of all the men of the East, which is particularly amazing since the men of the East were the richest in the world. He was the richest of the richest. Solomon's wisdom was once said to surpass all the sons of the East, 1 Kings 5 and 10. Verses 4 and 5. And his sons, that's Job's sons, went and banqueted, that means had meals, in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And when the days of their banqueting were gone about, Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job thought, it may be that my sons have sinned and blasphemed God in their hearts. Thus Job did every day. Now in the first 3 verses, Job's piety has been directly stated. His piety is now made clear by this example. The example of Job's piety is as follows. The sons of Job were wealthy and unmarried. They often held large feasts in their houses. These banquets were elaborate feasts of food and wine and may have lasted 3 days, as was customary, or even such as later we'll see in Jewish festivals, such as Passover, unleavened bread, or the Festival of Booths. The brothers, it appears, lived in their own homes, while the daughters lived with Job. The sons would invite their 3 sisters to these extended banquets. Job here appeared to be extremely sensitive to the temptation for his children to become too caught up with their wealth and life of ease. So at the end of each one of these banquets, Job would send for each of his 10 children. Job feared that his children may have blasphemed God in their hearts, meaning that possibly during these festivals they may not have thought deeply about God or forgotten his goodness towards them, or they may have possessed some over-affectionate love for the world, having it such an easy life. So Job brought each of these children one by one and sanctified them. Job, as we see in the text, rose up early in the morning the day after the banquet, and offered a sacrifice for the secret sins of his children in order to decontaminate them. We come to our second point, verses 6 through 12. First dialogue between God and Satan, and now we're in heaven. The scene shifts to heaven. Verse 6 and 7. Now on a day when the children of God came and stood before the Lord, Satan came also among them. Then the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord, saying, From compassing the earth to and fro, and from walking in it. As I mentioned, now the scene shifts to the heavenly realm. The author presents us with a picture of a king, God being the king, sitting upon his throne with counselors coming to make reports. It is an assembly of the heavenly council. We do know that God is a spirit, and such a scene is not in the manner of that our eyes would expect, but the effect is the same. It is in this council of God with his angels and the devil that the fate of Job will be worked out. Here we learn that Job will never learn the cause of his suffering. He'll never know why he suffered. No matter how much Job suffers, God and his council in heaven remain silent and do not interfere or give Job any hope for an answer, understanding, or purpose to his suffering. We as the reader know that Job will suffer to justify God's claim that Job would be righteous even if God did not make him prosperous. But Job will never receive this insight. We must learn from this that we might also suffer without ever knowing the root cause. On a particular day, we're told God called the angels, and possibly even the demons, to himself to present themselves in order to make reports and to receive instructions. Among the children of God came Satan. We know that angels report to God, for they are always in his presence. But it may be that demons also were responsible to report to God. I know that seems strange, but they are subordinate to God's authority, like the angels. And anything subordinate to God must do what God tells them to do. Whether Satan was summoned by God or just appeared, he was also required to make a report and explain his whereabouts. Satan is questioned and must, because he's a subordinate, give an answer. God asks for a report from the devil. It is possible that God had previously commanded Job to travel throughout the earth to observe the righteous and their loyalty to God, and then report his findings. God might have already sent him to look at Job, and then forced him to report his findings of Job. We don't know. Verse 8. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou not considered my servant Job, how none is like him in the earth, an upright and just man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Job is God's boast. God contrasts the loyalty of Job with the disloyalty of Satan, and shows Satan the happiness that he lost in the fall. God calls Job his servant and describes him in the same four terms as in verse 1, that he is upright, just, one who fears God, and who flees from evil. The question reads like a taunt, provoking Satan to consider his own lack of loyalty to God. Satan is the accuser and spends his time accusing saints of their unworthiness to enter into the kingdom of heaven. God responds to these accusations by showing Satan how unlike he is to Job. Verses 9 and 10. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Naught means nothing. Hast thou not made an hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. Here we see the devil's only real power, to bring doubt and call into question the true nature of reality. Satan could not bear to hear Job praised. Yet Satan cannot question Job's goodness, his sincerity, or his genuineness. So he calls into question the link between Job's godliness and his prosperity. His prosperity means all his wealth. Satan implies that Job is loyal and just, but only to sustain all the riches that God has given to him. The cause, says the devil, of Job's loyalty is his prosperity. Take away, the devil says, take away his prosperity, and he'll no longer be loyal to God. If Satan cannot question Job's actions, he can at least call into question Job's motivation behind those actions. The devil immediately draws attention away from the godliness of Job by focusing on all the good that God has done for Job. Satan argues that Job has been protected as if by a thorn hedge and kept from all manner of harm. Everything that Job worked to succeed prospered, and so God gave Job blessing but never harm. Notice Satan is also calling into question God's goodness to his people, suggesting that God bribes men for loyalty. Verse 11, Satan continues to talk to God here. Satan says, "But stretch out now thine hand and touch all that he hath, to see if he will not blaspheme thee to thy face." Satan's language here becomes abrupt and disrespectful, like saying, "to thy face." You don't talk to someone like that. Not fitting of the language required of a servant to his king. Perhaps Satan's reasons it wise to use insulting speech in order to insult and provoke God. Satan proposes that the only way to be certain of Job's loyalty would be to remove those blessings and to make him poor. Satan argues that since piety and prosperity are linked together here, the one, prosperity, must be removed to make a fair trial of Job's piety. Satan's proposed solution lies only in a reversal of Job's fortunes. Satan challenges God to a trial, and God, already knowing the answer, agrees in order to prove to Satan that Job is righteous without his wealth. Verse 12. Then the Lord said unto Satan, Lo, all that he hath is in thine hand. Only upon himself shalt thou not stretch out thine hand. So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. God agrees to the trial of Job, but why? We know that God does not need to be convinced, but could it be that God is prepared to allow Satan to be convinced of this reality? Or does God resent Satan's insinuation against Job and desire to see Job vindicated against Satan's charges? Or does God assent to the trial of Job's piety in order to refine or to deepen Job's faith? We notice that Satan must ask permission from God to whatever he does. He's his dog on a leash. We should not fall into the mistaken thinking that God is not responsible for what happens to Job because he permits it rather than doing it. Or the false notion that Satan is solely at fault while God is an idle observer. That is completely false. According to the book of Job, God is wholly responsible for what happens to Job. It's not God permitting it, so he's not responsible. God is wholly responsible for everything that happens to Job. And that's what this book teaches. For instance, there are 3 reasons why God is wholly responsible. 1, God's delegated permission is the same as his delegated authority. And the ultimate delegator has the ultimate authority. Job bears that out. Secondly, the book of Job makes no distinction between command and permission. They're the same thing. What God permits, he commands. They're the same. And 3, throughout the book, Job regards his affliction as an act of God, not as an act of Satan. He sort of blames God. He never blames Satan. So, although Satan does it, God is wholly responsible for it. Verses 13 to 22. 4 disasters against Job on earth. Verses 13 through 19. We'll treat these as a whole. And on a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, there came a messenger unto Job and said, The oxen were plowing and the asses feeding in their places, and the Sabaeans came violently and took them. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, but I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, another came and said, The fire of God is fallen from the heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and devoured them. But I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, another came and said, The Chaldeans set on 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have taken them, and have slain the servants with the edge of the sword. But I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, came another, and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from beyond the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, which fell upon the children, and they are dead. And I alone am escaped to tell thee. The focus in these verses is entirely upon Job. It is not the disasters that are important, but Job's reaction to these disasters. It is Job that is on trial in this book. There are 4 disasters here and 4 messengers. Each messenger arrives just before the previous messenger has finished his report. Each messenger is the sole survivor of the disaster he describes. The 4 disasters alternate between human and supernatural. For instance, first the human Sabaeans attack, followed by the supernatural lightning. Then an attack by the human Chaldeans, followed by the supernatural whirlwind. The disasters strike from all 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. The disasters increase in intensity. Each is worse than the previous. The first one, we have 1,000 oxen died, 500 asses and servants. The second one is worse, 7,000 sheep or goats and servants. The third is worse, 3,000 camels. Camels were more expensive. And servants. And the fourth is the last, Job's children. The 4 disasters eliminate all of Job's possessions mentioned in verses 2 and 3. The number 4, numbers are important in Job, represents the complete ruin, as in Ezekiel 14:12-23, where there's the complete ruin by famine, wild beasts, the sword, and plague, or the complete ruin of the 4 horns of Zechariah 2:1-4, or the 4 angels of Revelation 9:13-15. The disaster begins, we're told, when all the children are gathered for a banquet on the same day. It was a normal day, as we're told, in this tranquil setting. The oxen were plowing and the asses feeding in their places. First the Sabaeans arrived, enticed by Satan, no doubt, and stole oxen and asses, as they were famous for doing. But killing the servants was more than their usual crime. Next there was lightning, here called fire from heaven, also called that in Numbers 11 and 16, and Genesis 19, which Job likely interpreted as the wrath of God. No doubt Satan had hoped this would appear as God's disfavor and make Job to curse God. The third disaster was the Chaldeans, who robbed Job of his final possessions, including 3,000 camels and servants. And then the final disaster was a whirlwind sweeping in from the desert. But this was no ordinary storm. It blew from 4 directions at the same time. Now Job had lost his most valuable possession, or children, all 10 of them. They all died together. Not one of them was kept alive to comfort Job. We assume that the boys here were unmarried, for everything was taken from Job, and there were no widows even left to comfort Job. Since our children are pieces of ourselves, when they die, we also die in part, and this was Satan's purpose, to completely destroy Job. Verses 20-22, Job's reaction. Then Job arose and rent his garment